4 hours, not a whispered threat behind closed embassy doors, not a classified signal buried in intelligence feeds, a public announcement broadcast openly with a countdown already running. In 4 hours, every energy site across the region will be targeted. That was the message, and the world had to decide, in real time, whether to believe it. This is not a story about missiles or military strategy. This is a story about the moment a number, 4 hours, became the loudest sound in global politics. Because what follows a warning like that is not just fire and smoke. What follows is a question every economy on Earth suddenly has to answer. How long can you survive? What comes next? The warning did not arrive in a vacuum. It was a response. Days earlier, American strikes had hit Iranian oil infrastructure with enough force to turn the sky above Tehran toxic. Iranian health authorities issued emergency advisories telling residents to discard unsealed food, replace water filters, and avoid breathing outdoor air without protection. The air above one of the world's major oil-producing nations had become, in the most literal sense, poisonous. Iran looked at that toxic sky. It looked at its civilian population being told their food might be contaminated and their air unsafe to breathe. And then it said, clearly and publicly, we will create the same conditions across every energy facility in your region. The targets listed were comprehensive: oil refineries, natural gas plants, liquefied natural gas terminals, storage depots, export ports, desalination-adjacent power stations. Every category of infrastructure that keeps modern civilization functional was placed on a single list. When trading opened that morning, oil markets registered the announcement instantly. Prices moved, investors recalibrated. The numbers that appeared on screens across financial centers in New York, London, and Singapore reflected a new reality, one where Gulf energy infrastructure was no longer assumed to be stable. Within hours of the announcement, the American president was at a microphone, not with a military briefing, with a declaration that America would force the Strait of Hormuz open. The statement was designed to do one thing: talk prices down before the damage compounded. It did not fully succeed. The figure that Iran put into the conversation was $200 per barrel. Not a random number, not a bluff constructed to sound frightening. A calculated projection of where global oil prices would go if Gulf energy infrastructure sustained the kind of damage Iran was describing. And the logic behind that number, when examined carefully, is not easy to dismiss. At $200 per barrel, commercial aviation becomes economically inviable for most carriers. Ticket prices stop reflecting supply and demand and start reflecting survival mathematics for airlines whose fuel costs have tripled. At $200 per barrel, everything transported by road, which is to say, nearly every consumer product in any developed economy, arrives at a shelf price that is not a percentage higher, but a multiple higher. Groceries, medicine, clothing, electronics, the supply chain that delivers daily life to ordinary households breaks down not gradually, but suddenly. At $200 per barrel, the agricultural system feeding 8 billion people faces input costs that translate directly and immediately into food prices hundreds of millions of people cannot absorb. Petrochemical-based fertilizers become inaccessible to small-scale farmers in the developing world. Mechanized farming becomes economically prohibitive in regions that feed continents. The food system does not crack slowly. It fractures along lines that have been under pressure for years and were waiting for exactly this kind of shock. Iran's argument to America was cold and precise. Iranian domestic oil is subsidized. Iranian civilians pay government-controlled prices regardless of what global markets do. Iran can sustain $200 global oil indefinitely. The question it placed before Washington was simple. Can you say the same? Can your voters? Can your economy absorb what $200 oil does to gasoline prices, grocery bills, heating costs, and the political patience of an electorate that was already registering 90% opposition to this conflict before the energy war began? The Gulf states caught between these two forces found themselves in a position with few good options. Their oil storage clocks were running down. Iraq was looking at roughly 6 days of remaining oil storage capacity. Kuwait was at 14. The United Arab Emirates and Qatar were in the 15 to 20-day range. Even Saudi Arabia, with its larger buffer, had already consumed weeks of that reserve. When those tanks reach capacity, production stops. When production stops and global demand does not, price does not negotiate, it spikes. Oman, the Gulf nation historically known for its careful diplomatic neutrality and its role as a quiet back channel between adversaries, made a public statement that shifted the regional conversation. American and Israeli actions against Iran were described as illegal and as constituting the most serious aggression in the region's modern history. When Oman uses language like that publicly, the private language circulating through every Gulf capital is significantly stronger. In Moscow, Russia's foreign minister met with Gulf state ambassadors who arrived carrying a request: pressure Iran to stop its operations. The response that came back was framed as a question: has anyone at this table condemned the strikes that killed over 200 schoolgirls in Iranian territory? Has anyone moved an international resolution against the countries that initiated this conflict? The ambassadors had no answer, because the answer was no. 9 days into a conflict that began with strikes on Iranian soil, the international response had moved toward pressuring the country that was attacked rather than the countries that attacked it. Russia then stated something clearly enough that it could not be interpreted as ambiguous. It was not going to legitimize a framing in which Iran is the aggressor. It was not going to pressure a country it viewed as defending itself against an attack that the international community had largely declined to condemn. This matters beyond the immediate military situation, because Russia holds a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Any resolution seeking to impose international pressure on Iran, any ceasefire demand backed by binding authority, any multilateral action requiring Security Council approval, requires Russian consent. Russia had just announced it would not provide that consent. China's position added another layer to a diplomatic environment already running out of options. In the earlier stages of the Gaza conflict, Beijing had repeatedly declined to directly condemn Israeli military operations and instead kept returning to a single analytical point: the root cause of the regional instability is American involvement. Address the root cause. At the time, analysts described this as fence-sitting, as diplomatic evasion dressed up in strategic language. Looking at the current situation, with American regional defense architecture severely degraded, American carrier groups repositioned away from the theater, American credibility in the region at a historic low, and American domestic opposition to the conflict approaching near total saturation, China's framing does not look like evasion. It looks like the most accurate strategic diagnosis anyone offered when the situation could still have been managed differently. The toxic air above Iranian oil infrastructure deserves specific attention because it represents something beyond military damage assessments. When oil infrastructure burns at the scale and intensity of what occurred, the atmospheric release is not simply smoke and heat. Petrochemical compounds, benzene, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, heavy metal particulates enter the air in concentrations that are carcinogenic with sustained exposure and capable of contaminating soil, water systems, and food supplies in the affected radius for months after the physical fires are extinguished. Iran's health authorities telling people to throw away unsealed food and replace contaminated water filters was not a precautionary overreaction. It was an accurate description of what large-scale oil infrastructure destruction does to the environment where people live. And Iran had just announced that it would create the same environmental reality across Gulf energy facilities, in cities built in deserts with no natural water supply, dependent on energy-intensive desalination for every drop of drinking water, with dense urban populations in areas where environmental contamination has nowhere to dilute. The human cost of that scenario does not appear in immediate military casualty reports. It appears in hospital admission rates 6 months later, in cancer diagnoses years later, in the quiet suffering of populations who breathed contaminated air during a conflict their governments did not choose and cannot easily exit. Europe was watching all of this from a position that offered very few alternatives. Britain's gas reserves were under pressure. Germany's industrial base was already making production decisions shaped by energy costs that had not returned to pre-crisis levels. The continent had structured its post-Russia energy strategy around Gulf liquefied natural gas as its primary alternative supply source. That alternative was now facing the same conflict that had eliminated the Russian supply option. There was no third source waiting to absorb both shocks simultaneously. The strategic picture that had emerged by this point was one that China had described early, and that most Western governments had declined to take seriously when taking it seriously might have allowed for different choices. Every American military engagement in the Middle East over the preceding 3 decades had rested on a core assumption: American technological advantage creates an overwhelming, predictable, controllable military superiority that converts any confrontation into a manageable operation with definable costs and a clear endpoint. That assumption had been tested against an adversary with real preparation, genuine institutional resilience, advanced missile technology, and a domestic political cohesion that did not collapse under external military pressure. The assumption did not hold, not because American strikes failed to cause damage. They caused significant damage. The assumption failed because the objective was not damage. The objective was Iranian collapse, capitulation, or internal revolt. None of those outcomes occurred. Iran absorbed the strikes, maintained its command infrastructure, continued offensive operations across multiple theaters, and escalated to hypersonic missile systems while announcing the next phase of its response. The people paying the cost of that strategic failure were not the decision makers who built the strategy. They were workers in Gulf cities who lost employment overnight, migrant laborers unable to secure transportation home, European households receiving winter energy bills that had redefined their financial reality, Iranian civilians breathing poisoned air, communities along conflict lines where missile warning systems had stopped providing reliable advance notice. What Iran's 4-hour announcement actually did, beyond its military dimension, was force a specific question into visible territory. The question was not whether $200 oil was possible. The question was whether America's domestic political tolerance for $200 oil was higher than Iran's tolerance for continued strikes on its soil. Iran had already provided its answer. Its domestic energy prices are state-controlled. Its civilian population is insulated from global market fluctuations in a way that no democratic government with open markets can replicate. America's answer was visible in polling data showing 90% opposition to the conflict, in the political mathematics of an electorate facing gasoline prices and grocery costs that follow crude oil into territory that makes daily life economically painful, in the structural reality that American political institutions are not designed to absorb sustained civilian economic pain without consequence at the ballot box. The 4 hours passed. Markets opened. Oil moved. The world that had existed before this conflict, the one in which American military presence in the Gulf was treated as a stabilizing constant, in which Gulf cities were among the safest urban environments on Earth, in which energy prices were a variable managed by policy rather than a countdown clock managed by conflict, that world had not survived the 9 days of war intact. What remains is a set of choices that were available from the beginning and that become more expensive with every passing hour. The arithmetic of $200 oil does not pause for diplomatic negotiations. The storage clocks in Gulf-producing countries do not reset because a ceasefire is being discussed somewhere. The toxic compounds settling into Iranian soil do not wait for international tribunals to assign responsibility. The decisions that were postponed in favor of military action are now waiting at higher cost under worse conditions, with fewer options and more damage already done. History does not record the wars that were avoided. It records the ones that were fought and what they cost. The 4-hour warning is already part of the record. What follows it is still being written, one barrel at a time, one city's air quality report at a time, one household energy bill at a time, in languages spoken by people who never chose to be part of this equation and who will carry its consequences long after the headlines have moved on.